I thought I'd first talk about why I chose the topic of examining a sustainable approach to global climate change policy for my research. So the climate change part, sort of just a natural progression from my bachelor's and master's work in atmospheric science and climate change science. The sustainable approach to the problem of climate change is also probably not surprising because I'm in the School of Sustainability here at ASU. But there's also this other sort of major component to my research where I'm looking at human development and the relationship between human development and this problem of global climate change. And so that particular component of my work, I think, deserves a little bit more explanation. And so the motivation behind that really stems from a trip that I took to Uganda in the fall of 2011. So on my trip, I assisted on a research project that involved both educating and empowering students in Uganda by teaching them how to generate electricity. So the idea was by giving them this knowledge, they would then take that and apply it in ways that they could build their own electricity generating devices using materials available to them that are affordable and located in their own local economies, for example. And so when I went on this trip, I didn't really know how this was all going to relate to the research. But I very quickly became aware of how we as Americans, and also just people living in sort of the Western world, really take for granted the energy services that we have available to us. So just by a simple flick of a switch or a turn of a knob on our stoves, we have the energy available to us to take care of these daily tasks that we need to perform. Yet on the other side of the world, we have these kids here who live day to day without ever using a light bulb, and who heat their homes and eat using biomass sources. And so looking back on this trip, it really seems to be a very major influential experience for me in beginning to think about how the quality of a person's life relates to the energy services they have access to, and also how that relates to the problem of climate change. So the trip to Uganda helped me to start sort of thinking about and conceptualizing the relationship between CO2 development and energy. But we can also understand this relationship a little bit better if we look at some empirical data. So this graph shows on the x-axis primary energy consumption per capita. And on the y-axis we have human development in terms of the Human Development Index. So this deserves a little bit more explanation as well. So in my talk, I'll refer to this notion of human development. And I'm specifically referring to the United Nations Human Development Index. And I will go through the specifics of how this index is calculated in a few minutes. But for now, it's just important to recognize that this is a composite index that includes indicators of health, education, and income. And these indicators are combined into a single value and normalized on a scale from 0 to 1. So here in the US, our HDI value is relatively high, so it's around 0.9. Whereas a country like Uganda, it would be more around the 0.3 level. And so you can see the relationship between energy consumption and human development is more or less a direct relationship. So as energy consumption increases, we see rising levels in human development index levels. And particularly this relationship is very much direct among nations with lower values of HDI. So this isn't really surprising if you think about the good that a light can do in a dark room or business, the capabilities of having a charged cell phone can allow people. So this is a picture of a cell phone charging station where people leave their phones, say, while they go shopping, and they come back and pick it up and they pay for this service since they don't have this type of service available in their homes, for example. And then we can't deny the benefit that can accrue from being able to refrigerate vaccines and also to perform medical services, say, at night, for example. And so these are just a few examples of how energy consumption relates to human development. However, energy has a downside under current technology constraints. As we're all very much aware, the production of energy releases greenhouse gas emissions, which is a major contributor to the problem of climate change. So in this pie chart on the left, we see the major greenhouse gas emission types, and you can see the majority of this pie chart is taken up by carbon dioxide emissions, or CO₂. And then in the pie chart on the right, we then see the activities contributing to these emissions. So we see things like energy supply, transport, industry, agriculture. And when you think about these types of activities, most of them, and maybe about 3/4 of this pie chart, are made up of activities that directly relate to energy services. And so climate change is complicated by this dilemma of fossil fuels, where it's both an ingredient for human development, which we showed on the previous slide, and it's also a major contributor to the climate change problem, so increasing average temperatures. And so we focused a lot about the problem, so now I'll sort of switch gears and talk a little bit more about some solutions. So the common neoclassical economic approach to addressing the problem is to think about climate change as an externality problem. So greenhouse gas emissions, they build up in the atmosphere and affect society in many ways that are not captured in the market system. So for example, we have sea level rise, melting of the polar ice caps, human health impacts, and severe weather events, and this is just to name a few. And so then the goal is to quantify these impacts, so placing a monetary value on the cost, say, to fix these externalities, and then this allows us to put a sort of true cost on carbon, which then brings these externalities into the market system, or so they become internalized. So, and this is of course really difficult and controversial to come up with estimates of a value for these things. And if you think about it, right, it's very debatable how much of a value you can put on a human life or the melting of the polar ice caps. And so when we think about externalities and placing a monetary value on these types of climate impacts, basically the problem becomes simplified into something that looks like this. So here we have CO₂ emissions along the x-axis, and we have income represented by the gross national income per capita on the y-axis. Now the size of these bubbles, I mean they're different countries, but the size of the bubbles represent the relative size of population in each country. So you see there's more or less this direct relationship or linear relationship between increases in CO₂ emissions and gross national income. And so what happens is when you view the problem in this sort of light, there is a trade-off between economic development and reducing CO₂ emissions. And so when we try to then think about the problem in an economic light, the solution then becomes an economic solution, right? So the common economic solution is to use a cap and trade type system. So the idea here is that we place an overall cap on the amount of emissions that we allow globally, and this takes care of the scale of greenhouse gas emissions. And then emission permits are then distributed among different polluting parties below that cap. And then this emissions trading system allows the polluters to trade their permit allowances between one another. So basically, if you have a party that's producing emissions over their permitted amount, and if you have a party that's producing less than their allowed amount, then a trade can happen between the two. So basically, you get money flowing from the big polluters to the less polluters, and emission allowances moving towards the bigger polluters. And so this results in the allocation of emissions to the most economically efficient producers who can produce the most goods for the least amount of emissions. However, if we sort of broaden our definition of development beyond just economic value or in terms of monetary values, the empirical relationship changes, and sort of this cap and trade solution may be less appropriate. So here we have the same x-axis, so CO₂ emissions in tons per capita, Except now on the y-axis we're back to this Human Development Index. Again, the countries' size of the bubbles represent the relative size of the population of the countries. So just a reminder, the Human Development Index has within it both economic and social indicators. So health is represented by life expectancy, education by mean and also expected years of schooling, and also income is represented by gross national income per capita. So instead of a more linear relationship, we start to see a diminishing returns to human development as CO2 emissions increase. And so when we think about efficiency, not in economic terms, but say in terms of human development efficiency, the most efficient nations by that definition actually become the underdeveloped or developing nations that are seeing huge returns in human development for small increases in CO2 emissions. So from this view, reductions in CO2 are then not necessarily at odds with human development among the most developed nations. And so when I'm thinking about taking a sustainable approach to the problem of climate change, this is the relationship that I'm really focusing in on. So CO2 emissions and human development. And so this sort of begs the question, well, what do I mean by sustainable? And so here I'm adapting the Brundtland Commission definition of sustainable development. So development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I'm taking this systems approach to development and the climate change problem by considering aspects in each of these sustainability pillars. So, and I'm sure you've seen this figure many times, but I think it helps to really explain how I'm sort of covering all these bases. So in terms of the environmental pillar, as I showed before, my independent variable is CO2 emissions. And then for my dependent variable using the HDI, I am encompassing both economic and social indicators of development. So in terms of economic indicators, right, it's represented by the GNI per capita within the index. And then the social indicators are life expectancy and years of schooling. So the way I presented sort of the neoclassical economic approach to this climate change problem, you can sort of conceptually think about that approach as focusing mainly on these two ellipses. So that's not to say that an economic model does not include some sort of consideration for social impacts, but it's sort of presented in a way that it's monetized. So it's still sort of coming from that economic lens. Here, alternatively, I'm sort of adding this social ellipse in a way that thinks about life expectancy and years of schooling as in sort of a non-monetized way. So the intrinsic value of things like health and education in a person's life. My research objectives are to first understand the implications of emission restrictions and an unrestricted CO2 permit market on international human development. And then I want to explain how development may be appropriately integrated with mitigation policy. So here's my methodology. First, I empirically examined the role that CO2 plays in human development. I have two specific investigations that I completed, and I will show you the results of them in just a minute. Then with that empirical data, I established a theoretical framework for trying to clarify and understand the CO2 development relationship. And then finally, I offer a universal policy proposal that integrates concerns for economic costs, but also advances this development equity approach to climate policy.